Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the launch of the report on 1.5-degree lifestyles towards a fair consumption space for all. My name's Andrew Sims. I co-direct or coordinate a project called the Rapid Transition Alliance that works with hot or cool, and run a think tank called the New Weather Institute. I'll be your moderator for the day, although given the scale of the problems that we're facing, I almost feel as if I should be the alarmer. People always say that we're terribly alarmist in this movement, but when you look at the figures, things are really alarming. So I shall sort of moderate this alarming subject. We have a very packed 1 hour with lots and lots of content and lots of interaction. So we're looking forward to your questions, and I hope you're looking forward to the presentations. We think that one of the missing ingredients in this whole debate has been imagination. That has been our failure to visualize the scale of the change needed to achieve 1.5-degree lifestyles, and perhaps also a failure to imagine the possibility of that change actually happen, which is one of the reasons why the Rapid Transition Alliance is so happy working with Hot or Cool, because Hot or Cool very much has been doing the first, and we've been doing the second, which is a kind of a teamwork thing going on. We've got a joint mission to help visualize the change that's needed and to take perhaps the sting out of the fear of achieving that change. Now, this report is different to the first 1.5 degrees report, which was a groundbreaking publication. It's expanded. It looks at 10 countries, all in the G20, apart from Finland. It goes into more detail on the policies about how it can be used and what policies are needed for the kind of lifestyle change that the report is looking at. It also has scenarios for all these countries, taking us from now to 2030. It's incredibly important that we stop thinking about change which is going to be happening from 2030 to 2050 and what is actually needed to happen right now. Now, the first report was incredibly influential. It was the springboard for other initiatives like the Cambridge Commission. It's been picked up by everyone from UNEP to the EU and the C40 Cities initiative. Just a word on how things are going to happen today. Please use the chat function to introduce yourself. We have hashtags. No self-respecting launch is without hashtags these days, and our hashtags for the day are fair consumption and 1.5, that is 1 the number, point the word, and 5 the number. With that, I am going to take up no more time at all and move directly to introduce Sandrine Dixon de Clèves, who is co-president of the Club of Rome, who also wrote the foreword to this report. She's holds several advisory positions for the European Commission, including chair of the expert group on economic and societal impact of research and innovation. So with that, over to you, Sandrine.
Thank you so much, Marcus, and also Andrew and everyone else, Johan and Lewis, that are here today launching this incredible report with us today. I would like to first start by reminding everyone that actually a lot of this discussion already started in 1972 with the limits to growth. And I just want to read something that I think is absolutely fundamental when we talk about systems change and lifestyle change, which was already said and pronounced in 1972 by Donella Meadows. People don't need enormous cars. They need admiration and respect. They don't need a constant stream of new clothes. They need to feel that others consider them to be attractive, and they need excitement and variety and beauty. They don't need electronic entertainment. They need something interesting to occupy their minds and emotions, and so forth. Basically, what Donella was already saying then is we needed to place a value on what was most fundamental. And we needed to start to shift from consumption of material things, thinking that that was going to make us feel good, that that was going to bring us the wealth that we needed to be prosperous and our livelihoods. And I think this is incredibly important as we go through this report and we think through this post-COVID era that we are now in, that we address where we actually are in terms of that very fundamental thinking already in 1972. We have a series of global tipping points, the social system, and in fact, Johan will talk about the planetary boundaries and our environmental tipping points, but we now know, and in particular at the Club of Rome, we're very concerned about the social tipping points. the social systems that are actually deteriorating before our eyes. And we saw the tension again through COVID, the political system and the polarization and distrust, the economic system, which does not place a value on what matters most, that actually continues to value brown rather than green, that doesn't bring in, again, the need to protect our lives and livelihoods as the primary focus of what decision makers should be doing. Mass unemployment, and you bring that into a global commons deterioration, the pandemic, the climate tipping points. And so what we're seeing is that this is the moment. And in fact, the new models that have come out already stress testing the limits to growth model have just shown recently that the 2020 predictions of collapse already in the limits to growth are here. So what does that mean? This will be the fastest economic transition in history. We need to shift to zero carbon, zero loss of nature, zero poverty, and zero pandemics. In our planetary emergency plan, we already started to think through, what do we need in terms of creating a just and equitable society? What do we need in terms of transforming our energy systems? We know we have to pull out of fossil energy, and we need to triple renewables and energy efficiency and low carbon technology investments. We have to internalize our externalities, and we need to ensure that we put in place the taxation systems that again place a value on the shifts that we need within our economic and financial systems. So I'm going to finish with what we're starting to do now, which is with Johan and others at Potsdam Institute and Norwegian Business School. We've decided that it's fundamental that we bring a project through modeling 5 pathways to decision makers' attention. We call these the turnarounds. What do we need to do to deal with population growth? How can we empower people in order to ensure that they actually are truly living positive lives and livelihoods? How do we address inequality? How do we address poverty? And then how do we look at 2 key systems which are fundamental for our survival: energy and food, and the interrelationships between all of those together. And if we look at that within some key economic system shifts, moving towards a well-being economy that takes into consideration shifting from GDP to economic, social, and environmental indicators together within the planetary boundaries, as so well explained through our member Kate Raworth's donuts, then we know that we can create the alternative future that we need. We've got well-being economies that are starting to move in this direction. We have local economic shifts that are happening at the local level, more towards the donut. And what this report is telling us is that actually what we need to do now as citizens, as people, is shift our lifestyles to truly create and enhance this change towards alternative futures. So I'll leave it at that. I think this report is fundamental in terms of setting the tone of what we can all do together and truly meet a 1.5-degree lifestyle.
Thank you so much, Sandrine. And that was such a powerful summary. I think we could probably leave it there for the rest of the morning. But no, we've got more for you. And just now that you've heard the first of the presentations, just a reminder that if you want to put questions, please use the Q&A function. And if you like one question and somebody's already got one in that you like, please vote it up, and then we will come to those during the Q&A section. But now we're going to move to Johan Rockstrom, Director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and he's also the professor at the Institute of Earth and Environmental Science at Potsdam University, and of course renowned for introducing and giving us the frame of planetary boundaries. Over to you, Johan.
Thanks, Andrew, and great to be with you. And from my side as well, congratulations to this not only timely but extraordinarily important report on the 1.5-degree lifestyles, and really taking a full stab at the integrated transformation and the equity dimensions. And I'd like to start by just, sharing or rather reminding us of where science is standing today. That 1.5, which up until quite recently could be, perceived as being some form of compromise with the low-lying island states in the dark late hour negotiations in Paris, in fact, today has ample I would even argue, unequivocal scientific support for being a real climate planetary boundary. We actually put the climate planetary boundary already in 2009, well below 1.5. It was actually set at roughly 1.2, recognizing that we have aerosol cooling and so many other greenhouse gases that would be equating to something around 1.5 degrees Celsius of global mean temperature. We have the IPCC 6 assessment report that now confirms that already at 1.1 degrees Celsius warming, we are feeling really serious damage for communities and economies around the world, but that we're also at risk of irreversible commitments on the Arctic, in the West Antarctic ice shelf, in the Atlantic, overturning of heat, AMOC, on tropical coral reef systems. 1.5 is a biophysically established planetary boundary for climate. We may be able to manage ourselves in a temporary overshoot beyond it, but it's today actually at a point where if we reach 2 and go beyond 2, we are entering unknown domain. We're entering a space we haven't seen for the past 3 million years, and we are at risk of really pushing away the Earth system from what we can call livable conditions that can take a fair responsibility for the world with civilizations as we define it. Now, the real big drama here is that the only way to land safely within 1.5 degrees Celsius is not to phase out fossil fuels alone, but a safe landing requires that we return within a safe operating space of all the planetary boundaries. That is the big challenge for this year in Glasgow. That has to sink in. In fact, we published recently in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences an analysis showing that already today, if we hadn't had the resilience in nature just on terrestrial ecosystems on land, we would have crashed through 1.5 already. Just the resilience in temperate and boreal forest and wetlands, soils, and tropical forests have already buffered 0.5 degree. But we also know that if we continue losing the cracks, as we are seeing more and more signs of, we are at risk of having self-amplifying impacts from the planetary boundaries outside of climate, the biosphere boundaries, that could actually push ourselves away from any chance of delivering on Paris. Just look at the latest science on the Brazilian part of the Amazon rainforest, which over just the last 10 years has tipped over from being one of the most precious carbon sinks on planet Earth to now being a carbon source. It's actually emitting. The richest biome on Earth is emitting more greenhouse gases than it is absorbing. This is, I would argue, like the signal to humanity that we are not only in an urgency point, but that a safe landing requires fair lifestyles within a safe operating space of a 1.5 degrees Celsius Earth system. It's not only about oil, coal, and natural gas, it is about biodiversity, fresh water, nitrogen, phosphorus cycles, land systems, all the aerosols and chemical pollutants in the same systems analysis. So the planetary boundary framework really translates into the ultimate definition of fairness, I would argue, meaning that the ultimate responsibility that we have as adult generation on watch on Earth today is to hand over a planet to our children and their children, which is at least in the same livable properties as the planet where we were ourselves born. Isn't that the ultimate definition of justice? Isn't that what 1.5 degrees Celsius lifestyles should fundamentally land in? This equitable handing over of a planet which is in a stability domain that can support human civilizations into the future. So what does all this imply? Well, it implies something that is so well articulated in this report, namely that we need a fundamental value shift. Because if we have the risk of transgressing biophysically hardwired tipping points in the Earth system, it of course leads to setting up guardrails, boundaries, which translates to finite budgets of natural assets, as pointed out, for example, in the most important economic analysis, I would argue, that we have recently, the Partha Dasgupta report for the UK government. Now, this is hard sustainability, but we've come to that point. This is what we need. And that is what really translates to justice, because that means we have a finite global carbon budget. We have a finite freshwater budget. We have a finite budget of nitrogen and phosphorus and so on. And that this has to be shared in an equitable way. And this report in a what I would argue to be the sharpest way so far can really build up a methodology of how that space should be shared and can be shared. Now, the drama or challenge is that this, as Sandrine and myself and many others are working on today, translates to exponential transformative pathways. There's no such thing anymore as incrementality. With the KR Foundation, we have quite recently, as you may know, supported the first behavioral change integrated science commission led by Professor Peter Newell and his colleagues at Sussex, showing that nudging along incremental pathways will not do the job. We're now at a point where we need these big turnarounds that Sandrine were referring to, which is something we're working on in the Earth for All initiative that will be presenting its results with the Stockholm Plus 50. It all boils together to this need of integrating Earth system science with equity, with transformative change. Now, do we have amplifying feedbacks to close this that can kind of support us in this direction? Well, I think one of the most important positive amplifying feedbacks, which again is so well described in this report, is that a landing zone within a safe operating space of a manageable, stable, and resilient planet is actually a journey not only of equity, but it's a journey of opportunity. It's a journey of next steps in modernity in terms of health, food security, avoiding displacement, migration, conflicts, and ultimately social stability. So we have something really fundamental here. We have a crisis. It's an integrated crisis. It requires taking on the full Earth system in a fair and just way, which we've never been able to do before. The limits to growth warned us already then. 50 years have gone, and we've so far, failed humanity in this respect. But we're also seeing, luckily, the emergence of so much evidence that we have the solutions that now can be scaled to start truly delivering a 1.5-degree lifestyle within the safe operating space of a stable and resilient 1.5 degrees Celsius Earth system. And this report is an important piece in that work. Back to you, Andrew.
Johan, thank you so much. You have the incredible ability of presenting the most alarming of pictures with the most calm voice I've ever heard. I'm sort of soothed while simultaneously overawed by the enormity of our challenge, and to speak to the enormity of our challenge, and perhaps the most profound problem now that we have this greater and better understanding of the sorts of changes that we need, are how we overcome the inertia of being locked in by our infrastructure, by our economics, and by our cultures. And this is all experienced in the lifestyles that we lead. So to talk us through the application of this analysis to how our lifestyles might change, we now hear from the lead author of the report, Louis Akenji, who's managing director of the Hot or Cool Institute, who came up with the original report as well. So he's now going to talk to us about what moving towards a fair consumption space for all actually looks like. Over to you, Louis.
Thank you, Johan and Sandrine, especially with how easily you deliver very alarming messages. And it's also a very good time to remind that this report is really about people. It's really at the center of it, what our aspirations are, what we think about our future, and the things that we are or are not doing to get there within the budget, the planetary budget that we have. And it is, so when you listen to the numbers, some of them might be daunting, but when you listen to the numbers, please think of the faces behind it. And when you listen to these numbers, think of the systems that are nudging these lifestyles on, or those that are restricting progress towards solutions. Why did we take on this project? Well, for the first thing, because as everyone knows, touching on consumption is a political hot potato in the modern context. Democratic societies would say it's interfering in private consumption space, and businesses would say, well, they don't want to, kill the source of their profits. This is all a misconstruction of really of what Johan eloquently describes as delivering on a better planet with well-being conditions for future generations. It is also, we started this because when discussions come to lifestyles, they're always they talk a lot about, especially within the IPCC setting, it talks about territorial emissions, which is very good, and it really clarifies the problem, but it doesn't necessarily allow people to see where their lifestyles, where their ways of living land within these grand discussions. It is also worth then asking the question, with all the net zero commitments, with all the discussions about future technologies and so on, where are people's aspirations? How are they reflected? How do people contribute? Or what would people's everyday living look like in a future 1.5-degree society? This is why we think this report is extremely important. I would try to walk you through if my mouse would let me. All right, so what we did was we took from the IPCC figures, the carbon budget left for us to stay within 1.5-degree increase in temperature, and on an equitable basis distributed it across the populations in the world. We're using UN estimates. What it helped us to do was to understand what each person is allocated. And then we looked at current consumption using consumption-based emissions to understand what we're calling lifestyle carbon footprint. And with this, we came up with a number of where we are today and targets, which is 4.6 tons per person per year of CO2 equivalent. And we then set targets that are compatible with the 1.5-degree aspirational goal of the Paris Agreement. So in this case, I'll give you one of the first numbers that you should keep in mind. It is 0.7. Ultimately, this is where we need to be on a per capita basis per year if we want to live lifestyles that are compatible with the 1.5-degree aspirational target of the Paris Agreement. We're currently at 4.7. And I will try to show how this is reflected in a number of the countries that we looked at very closely in the report. We looked at Canada, Finland, the UK, Japan, China, South Africa, Turkey, Brazil, India, and Indonesia. What this picture already tells you is where the hotspots are, and also the vast inequalities that we see in the system. So let's take, for example, the footprint per capita for someone living in the UK already is bigger than the entire footprint of someone, lifestyle carbon footprint of someone living in India, not to talk of Canada, which is almost that of the entire India and Indonesia combined. So what this is already telling you is really the vast discrepancies we have in the system. What it is also saying is the vast drops we need to undertake in our in emissions from our consumption in order to get to the targets that we're talking about. Remember, we need to be at 0.7 by 2050 and 2.5 tons per person at 2030. This is the drop. This is quite indicative of the drop that we're talking about, going up to 82% for Canada. Now, one country manages to escape needing to reduce by 2030. In this case, it is Indonesia. But what it doesn't do is escape 2050. Almost every country we looked at, actually every country we looked at in this report still needs to drop emissions from consumption compared to where we need to be by 2050. I will go a little bit into just one of the domains that we analyzed. We looked at food, personal transport, housing, goods and services, leisure, and yes, leisure. And this is the one of food, for example. It looks like a graph, but it's actually a story of different cultures that we've constructed around the world. You can already see the role of meat or animal products and its significant impact on the planet. But looking at that, if you compare Canada, for example, to India, India is primarily a vegetarian-based community, and you see that the footprint there is significantly lower. I don't know about you, but I would argue that Indian food is pretty tasty. So you don't give up that much without, by adopting a vegetarian diet. The same thing for Indonesia, but you also see where rice consumption in Japan, in most of the Asian countries, begins to have a pretty significant impact, although it is primarily plant-based. Then in the mid to lower income countries, South Africa and in this case, Brazil stand out for their meat consumption. Johan was talking about the Amazon just a few minutes ago. It is worth knowing that quite a lot of this has to do with grazing and production of meat, not only to feed the Brazilians, but also to feed the rest of the world countries to which they export. We do such analysis for different domains in the report, so you'll be able to look a bit more closely once you download it. Now, we try to do some kind of a comparison to help people see a bit more clearly where the difference is and where these impacts are coming from. On the one hand, we look at intensity. That is how carbon intensive the options for consumption are. On the other hand, we look at the volume of consumption in the system. You can already tell that Canada is primarily, a car culture. Oh, sorry, the UK in this case is primarily a car culture. While Japan suddenly introduces something which you would not usually see when you look at a graph like this, ferries, and how carbon intensive they are in the case of Japan, primarily because they're fueled from fossil fuels. What we do in the report also is to start looking at options which we can calculate potential impacts, where if we have the right policies, it could help us to reduce this lifestyle carbon footprint. For all the countries we look at, three things stand out. This is the one for the UK, by the way. Three things stand out very clearly. If we want to solve this, there are three key areas. One, we need to start shifting to plant-based diets. We need to shift to renewable energy and wide-scale electrification. And we need to shift away from private car use, especially fossil fuel private car use, and flying to broader public systems, or those that are less dependent on fossil fuels. The last thing we do in the report is look at scenarios. And part of this is and in response to the question of whether we need behavior change or system change. And what we look at very carefully is for each one of these countries, what would it look like if we're to live within the 2030 target of 2.5 tons per person in each country? And we mark this for all the 10 countries that we look at. In this case, it's the UK. The point here is in all the countries we look at, we do not have the luxury of doing just behavior change or a system change. We need both. Time has passed to start saying whether it's one to shift or the other. We do this for Brazil and several other countries. And now to go to the theme of the report, we talk about a fair consumption space. These are the domains of consumption that we analyze in the report: housing, food, leisure, transport, personal transport services, and consumer goods. And we do know that especially when we talk about the planetary boundaries, that there are limits to consumption, as well as upper limits that are governed by the planetary boundaries. We also have lower limits where people should not fall under if they want to have a life of dignity in society. But then we have the over-consumers, which obviously is unsustainable. And we have those people that are under-consuming. They cannot even meet their basic needs. Within this is the negotiation space where we're allowed to exercise our lifestyles if we want to get to 1.5 degrees, as in the Paris Agreement. And it requires that we respect the ceiling beyond which we shouldn't go, and the floor beyond which we shouldn't let others fall, and to either increase or reduce rations. This is the idea of a fair consumption space. We introduced three sets of policies in this report. When going through them, it's worth to think about them in three ways. The first thing is we have a fast diminishing carbon budget. The IPCC tells us we need to peak by the middle of this decade if we want a 50-50% chance of staying within 1.5. We have vast increasing inequalities and differences in power, and we have threats to well-being. So what do we propose? We pick a number of policy options that are not commonly discussed, with the hope that at least beginning to have a conversation and implementing some of this really fast, we stand a fair chance. The first one is setting limits to consumption. In this case, we talk about choice editing. I'll expand a little bit more on that shortly. The second one is to take out the harmful consumption options. And we ask the question, which gets a lot of people uncomfortable, should we start talking about personal carbon allowances in this case? And the last set of policies is looking at a more equitable and well-being system. And in this case, we talk about a sufficiency-based approach to policy design. Just talking about choice editing, for example, traditionally what governments have done is use public safety and public health criteria to past policies. The argument we make is that in a climate emergency, you need sustainability criteria in order to design policies as well. In this case, especially areas that are highly carbon intensive and which have privatized benefits, where with distributed burdens need to be choice edited. Incentives, so areas such as private jets, mega yachts, and so on, and fossil fuel investments are really becoming a risk to our collective well-being. Incentives such as customer loyalty programs, frequent flyer programs, loyalty programs for hotels are beginning to become very dangerous because they lock people into consumption. And we need to start also introducing approaches that encourage a top runner approach, a race to the bottom, where the most innovative aspects become the default rather than a race to the top, I'm sorry, where the most innovative aspects become the default rather than a race to the bottom. And just to show you, things are already happening. This is not only at individual level. This is the Welsh government saying, because emissions from transport are causing more than 17% of their greenhouse gas emissions, they will stop further construction of roads. You just read about the Netherlands proposing radical plans to cut on its livestock numbers. And you know about a number of countries that are already committing to ban exploration of fossil fuels. So these are not too far off. These are things which with a little bit of a stretch, we can do very quickly, right? I would quickly go on the last four things that I want to highlight that come out of the report. The first one is that governments, as they regularly declare their targets for the GDP, they need to start establishing annual emissions reductions targets and to announce this and to monitor how they're achieving this. If we cannot get the right indicators, then we will not be measuring how we're dealing with this problem. The second one is that the SDG goal 12 is good, but it's not sufficient to actually lift the global transformation that is needed. It needs booster programs to be able to drive it. The third one is we talk too much about reductions and we do not really offer visions of what a sustainable future society would look like. We need to start integrating these visions, not only technology utopias, but actually showing how people are living well within limits and within psychological and social limits as well. And the last thing, but not the least, is we need unprecedented capacity building to undersee this kind of a transformation that we're talking about. This also includes a capacity to imagine new possibilities and a new civilization that is drastically different from the one that we have today. A lot more is found in the report. I hope you download and you read it. And I hope more than just having a conversation, we start pushing our policymakers and our neighbors and friends and ourselves to do something. Thank you so much.
That's fine, Lewis. Thank you so much. Now we're going to move on to our panel, who are free to pick up some of the threads of these questions, which we've been listening to, but we're going to look at some specific things for them as well. Now we're going to be hearing from Yamina Saheb, who writes a lot about sufficiency and policy design around achieving sufficiency, and was a contributing author to the current report, and is a lead author of the forthcoming IPCC report. We're going to hear also from Markus Terhu, who is involved with Shift 1.5, looking at work specifically in the situation in Finland with Citra, and also from Brian Sorensen, who's the executive director of the KR Foundation, to whom we're all enormously grateful for creating the space within which these conversations can happen. But I'm going to start with Yamina, because this question of sufficiency, again, perhaps in the level of the popular debate, it could be quite easily misunderstood for the old things they used to say about environmentalists wanting to go and live in caves and wear Hessian sacks on their back, etc. But obviously it's a much more sophisticated and detailed and nuanced sort of understanding of the changes we need to make. So I wondered if you could talk about a little bit about how the sufficiency approach differs from other current approaches at the moment.
Thank you for the short introduction and for the opportunity to contribute to the report and to this webinar launch. So currently, when we think about decarbonizing the global economy, we think mainly about efficiency improvement. So having a more efficient fridge, more efficient home, for example, and the decarbonization of the supply through the increase of the share of renewable production, energy production. And by doing these two, we miss actually around 30% of the emission reduction potential, because we don't do the first thing that we should be doing is questioning how do we need all these large homes? Do we need large cars? Do we need all these appliances and equipment that we have at home, etc.? And sufficiency is not new concept. Actually, it dates back even to the Greek time, the Greek civilization. However, using sufficiency as sustainability concept goes back to 30 years ago. And sufficiency, when you look at today, we have much more literature on sufficiency than 10 years ago. And when combining all the literature that exists on sufficiency, so I did come up with a definition of sufficiency, which I define as all the measures, the policy measures, and the daily practices. So this answers the point from Lewis about the behavior versus behavior change of individuals' behavior versus the structural changes. So we need the policy measures and the daily practices that avoid, and it's very important to the main difference between sufficiency and efficiency is that sufficiency avoids the demand for energy, materials, land, water, and other natural resources, while delivering well-being for all or decent living standards for all within planetary boundaries. So sufficiency does not mean that you will live in curves or you will reduce the level of comfort that you have. It's just that adjusts your the way the comfort is delivered and your perception of what is comfort. Is it more comfortable to be alone in 500 square meters or to be in space or sharing space with other people? And by sharing space with other people, you keep your privacy, of course, but by sharing space with other people, you reduce your energy demand and emissions, but you will also enjoy life better than when staying alone as an old person in 500 square meters. This is what sufficiency is about.
This is a wonderful image of the way in which making the changes that we need to make for survivability and to flourish also allows us the possibility of better lives. And I want to bring Marcus in on the conversation now, because Marcus, as I understand it, has been involved in generating a significant public discussion in Finland around these issues, and somehow or other has managed to engage at least 1 in 5 of the entire population. And I just want to ask you quite straightforwardly, how have you done that?
Okay, simply put, what we've done in Finland is look at a way, how do we involve everyone in this change? And we have chosen not to speak about carbon footprint to people, but to talk about how do you build good life that is sustainable. And we can make 100 different suggestions to you from which you can pick things that suit your current situation in life. And we can see that over 1 million people in Finland have engaged with this content. And those people who have built a personal plan of what to reduce and how to change can achieve on average in the first year of engagement a 30% cut in their personal carbon footprint. If we can reproduce that in the coming next 9 years, we have already cut by 51% the original carbon footprint. And very kind of simply, rule of thumb, every 10 years for the next 30 years, we need to cut by 50%, and we are meeting the goal that Lewis and the team are proposing here. And I think that that's the second part. How do we talk about the change path so that you are in control? No one else is pushing their favorite solution, what you should change. We should not look at what other people should do. We should look at what can I do to become part of the solution. And we think that it's possible to include a lot of people in this change, not only in Finland, but in other countries as well. So now we have 9 different countries. We have change maker teams who are starting to use the same methods that we have produced in Finland. And that's the next step. So how do we make this change happen across many countries without the fact that every change maker has to create their own tools, own ways of working? But how do we build on work that others have done so that we can take the science that Lewis and the team have provided and take that into action so that people know what to do on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and how to keep track of their change path?
That's wonderful, Marcus. So you've got a real kind of picture of how people can land all these big issues in a really practical day-to-day fashion in their day-to-day lives. Okay, I'd like to bring Brian into the conversation now, because in many ways, this is still a relatively new area for people, and the KR Foundation have been pioneers in opening up space in doing this. And I'd really like to hear from Brian. What was it that led you to decide to do that, and how you have seen the response of the rest of the philanthropy sector to this? Are they now picking it up too, or are you still sort of out there as sort of pioneers on your own?
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for having me. I see a lot of people attending whom I have a lot of respect for, working in this space. Well, it goes back to KR Foundation's mission, which is to address the root causes of climate change and environmental degradation. The foundation was set up in 2015, so we're relatively young, and almost immediately we set up a program to fund in the sustainable behavior and lifestyles space. We just quickly realized that to serve our mission, there was no way around addressing behavior and lifestyles in the fight to preserve a livable planet. But in order to engage in this area, one needs to know what a sustainable lifestyle is, right? When we started out back in 16 with the program, there wasn't yet an evidence base built around the Paris Agreement and the 1.5-degree target. And this all came together in the first 1.5-degree lifestyles report, which has been instrumental in making the conversation on behavior much more concrete, much more specific. And that's quite important for funders to engage. I mean, one just remembers the numbers, right? It's 2.5 tons in 30 and 0.7 in 2050. That's just such a sobering, very, very powerful message. So where does philanthropy stand? I think this is still a very, very difficult space for philanthropies to engage in. Some funders are moving into the evidence building kind of space, as we've been funding for quite a while with this brilliant work and the sustainable, the Cambridge Sustainable Commission, which Johan mentioned earlier. Also the UNEP GAP Chapter 6 report on, or the Chapter 6, the latest UNEP Emissions Gap report on lifestyles. We had a hand in. And we're also funding some of the integrated assessment modelers at Utrecht University to factor in behavior change in these models, because a lot of them are still heavily biased towards technology in that climate policy nexus. Another area where foundations can engage is in communication. Basically, just fund good communications efforts, and I think Rapid Transition Alliance is doing in this space is a really, really good example. There's advocacy efforts, there's specific on-the-ground behavior change projects, and then finally there's capacity building. I would say those were the 5 buckets that philanthropy could fund in. But it is, for many of the reasons that Lewis has already touched on, it is difficult for many foundations to engage, because frankly speaking, philanthropy is also a symbol of a lot of wealth and inequality, right? So there's this contradiction, which just makes it very difficult. We're a young foundation with a very sharp purpose to address the root causes of climate change, and that's just made it easier for us to engage. I mean, we have to engage in this space at this level.
Thanks, Brian. And that's a really good cue, perhaps, for a question which I can put to all 3 of you, which has been touched on a little bit by others, but it is the big one, and it's coming up again and again in our question. And this is the question of the inertia of the way things are at the moment, and that power is a big part of that. There's a lot of vested interest in what we do. So we can do our active and positive visualizations, but there is a question of how do we deal with power, with the sort of locked-in nature of elites and an elite sort of lifestyles, and what are the most effective steps that we can take to organize to address that? And I think we might as well go back through in the same order that we started with. So let's hear from Yamina. And these are just quick answers. And
sorry, I was talking to myself. Thank you. So one of the challenges that we face is that policies should be evidence-based, and I was delighted to read Brian, to hear Brian saying that they are funding modeling work, and the evidence-based actually comes from the models and the scenarios to meet the 1.5 degree target. And if you look at all the overall scenarios that exist that claim, because people claim first that they are Paris compliant, you have around 1,000 scenarios that are today claiming that are Paris compliant. When you dig into the details, out of the 1,000 scenarios, there are only 3 that include sufficiency measures and lifestyle changes. All the rest, at the best, they include bit of behavior change, and the behavior change, they don't include, they expect the behavior change to occur within the current existing infrastructure and cities, etc., which is just impossible. And we learned this from the Corona crisis, actually. It was, no one would have thought that Paris, for example, would speed up the biking lines like they did it because of the Corona crisis. By increasing the number of biking lines, not just in Paris, but also in cities in the developing world, in Bogota, for example, and in many other places in the world. So what happened is that people shifted. The behavior change cannot occur. Actually, the impactful behavior change cannot occur without offering to people the infrastructures that are needed. But to have policymakers making this change, we need to have scenarios based on lifestyle changes. And this is the missing piece. Maybe given that I have Brian here, maybe this is where foundations should focus, because currently all the I told you, out of 1,000, you have 3 scenarios. It's today in 2021, why we are in climate emergency. You cannot understand that. The young generation cannot understand that. And the point is,
you mean, I'm just going to jump in there because we're really tight on time, and I want to hear very quickly from Marcus and Brian, but that was a brilliant late pitch there, but perfectly slipped in. And the sorts of examples that Yamina was talking about, there's lots of stories about these changes like Paris and Bogota happening in practice on the rapid transition site. But to Marcus, very quickly.
It's a question of what do you believe is your most efficient way of driving change in your society. And we believe that bringing visibility to the grassroots level change that is already happening is at the moment missing. And we need more sophisticated tools for that. Once politicians, the elite and others see that normal, regular people are already changing their everyday practices, they are willing to change many things, but there are obstacles. They are locked in certain places. Then our politicians can be braver, our companies can be more innovative, and we will get companies, policymakers, the societal change makers, and individuals work in harmony towards 1.5 degree paths.
And a last word to Brian.
And I can just add philanthropy to what Marcus said.
Yes.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Brian. So just to finish, thank you all so much for joining us. Please go away, read the report, share it, use the hashtags fair consumption and 1.5, 1 the number, point the word, and 5 the number. That's hashtag fair consumption and hashtag 1.5. Keep the conversation going. We're only just beginning here. We need to build up a big community of interest and practice around this to make it happen. Follow this space, follow all the wonderful people you've listened to today, and thank you very much for being here. Thank you, and see you again.